The sun hadn't yet crested the mesa when Malachi Brooks heard the horse stumble and fall. He'd been splitting firewood behind his cabin axe, suspended mid-swing, when the sound carried across the alkali flats hoofbeats, irregular, desperate, then silence. In this country, silence meant death more often than not. He set down the axe and walked to the edge of his property boots, crunching on hardpan earth, scattered with brittlebush and cholla cactus. The morning air held that peculiar stillness that came before sandstorms, when even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Heat shimmer already danced on the horizon, though the sun barely touched the red sandstone cliffs that bordered his land like ancient fortress walls. There, a dark shape against the pale dirt, maybe 200 yards out beyond a stand of ocotillo. A horse down and thrashing weakly among the creosote bushes. And beside it, something smaller. Something that moved with the slow, deliberate motion of the dying. Malachi had learned to mind his own business in the 8 years since he'd claimed this patch of nowhere in the Dry Butte Territory. This land didn't suffer fools or good Samaritans. It consumed them like the desert consumed water. But as he squinted against the growing light, he made out long black hair and buckskin clothing. A Comanche girl, maybe 16 years old, crawling toward his cabin with a dark stain spreading across her back like spilled wine on leather. "Ain't your fight, Brooks?" He muttered to himself, the words automatic after years of self-imposed isolation. But his legs were already carrying him forward, muscle memory from a time when saving lives had been his profession instead of his curse. The girl collapsed face first into the dust as he approached, her fingers scraping futilely at the hardpan. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps that spoke of punctured lungs and massive blood loss. When he knelt beside her, she turned her head just enough to fix him with eyes that held more pain than any 16-year-old should carry eyes like Sarah's had been during those final fevered hours. "Please," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the morning wind that stirred the Palo Verde branches. "Not safe, Father. Killer." Her words made no sense, but the bullet hole in her shoulder blade did. Someone had shot her from behind close range, probably with an army Colt from the size of the wound. The entry was clean, but the exit had torn through her chest just below the collarbone, missing her heart by inches. She'd been riding hard when it happened. The horse had carried her miles before finally giving out among the barrel cactus and sage. Malachi gathered her into his arms, feeling how light she was, how her body burned with fever. As he lifted her, something fell from her clenched fist, a small wooden pendant carved in the shape of a horse. Child's work with initials scratched into the side, E.H. He pocketed the pendant without thinking and carried the girl toward his cabin. Behind them, her horse gave a final shudder and lay still, buzzards already circling high overhead like omens. The cabin sat in the shadow of a limestone bluff, built to withstand Apache raids and flash floods that could turn a dry creek into a torrent in minutes. Malachi had chosen the location, carefully water from a deep well that tapped an underground spring, natural fortification, and sight lines that stretched for miles across the desert floor. It was a place a man could defend, if he had to. He kicked open the door and laid the girl on his narrow bed. Her eyes had closed, but her breathing continued shallow and desperate, like a trapped animal. Blood soaked through her buckskin shirt, pooling on his quilt that had once belonged to Sarah. He'd need to work fast. The bullet had passed clean through, which was good. But infection would set in soon in this heat, and she'd already lost too much blood. He had medical supplies, a holdover from his cavalry days, when treating wounded men was part of staying alive. But treating a wounded Comanche girl in his cabin was signing his own death warrant. Her people would come looking, and they wouldn't ask questions first. As he cleaned the wound with whiskey that burned like liquid fire, she stirred mumbling words in Comanche that he couldn't understand. Then, clear as mountain water, "Father shot me. Not rescue, execution." Her eyes opened, focused on his face with an intensity that made his hands still. "You save me, he kill you too. 50 warriors come at dawn." Malachi felt ice form in his stomach despite the growing heat of the day. "Your father shot you." She nodded, a movement that cost her dearly fresh blood seeping through the bandages. "I saw truth. Children dead. He make it look like soldiers. War paint on murder." Before he could ask what she meant, she closed her eyes again, her breathing growing more labored. Malachi finished cleaning the wound and began bandaging it with strips of clean cloth. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind raced like tumbleweeds in a dust devil. If what she'd said was true, he was harboring a witness to something that could start a war or expose one already begun. And if her father really was coming with 50 warriors, this cabin would become a tomb before the sun reached its zenith. But as he worked, he thought of another girl, another time when he'd been too late to save a life that mattered. Sarah's face floated behind his eyes, 12 years old, burning with fever, calling for her mama, while typhoid consumed her from the inside like desert fire. He'd carried her body to an unmarked grave beside a nameless creek, and something in him had died with her buried deep as any corpse. This girl still breathed, still had a chance. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying dust and the scent of rain that would never come to this parched land. Malachi finished the bandaging and stepped to the window, scanning the horizon past the Joshua trees and Spanish bayonet. Nothing yet. But dawn was coming, and with it whatever truth this girl carried that was worth killing for. He checked his Winchester and counted his ammunition. 43 rounds. Against 50 warriors, it wouldn't be enough. But it would have to do. The girl stirred again, and when he looked down at her, she was watching him with those pain-filled eyes. "Why you help me?" Malachi was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind whistle through the limestone eaves where cliff swallows nested. "Because somebody should have helped my daughter when she needed it most." She nodded as if this made perfect sense, then closed her eyes again. "My name, Ayanna, means eternal blossom." "The Malachi Brooks," he replied, though she probably already knew that. News traveled fast in Indian country, carried by smoke signals and war drums across the endless desert. As the first light of true dawn touched the mesa tops, painting them gold, like the treasure men died seeking Malachi. I saw them riders on the horizon, moving like dark smoke against the pale sky. 50 warriors, just as she'd said. They rode in perfect formations, war paint bright as blood on their faces, lances and rifles glinting in the early light, like deadly flowers blooming in the desert air. At their head rode a man Malachi recognized from wanted posters and army briefings, Chief Takoda, the ghost of the Llano Estacado. A leader who'd kept his people alive through cunning and cruelty, who'd made the U.S. cavalry look like fools chasing their own shadows for the better part of a decade. And if Ayanna was telling the truth, he was also a cold-blooded killer who'd shot his own daughter to keep her quiet as a desert grave. The warriors stopped just out of rifle range, their horses stamping and snorting in the morning air that smelled of sage and coming heat. Takoda rode forward alone, stopping perhaps 100 yards from the cabin, where a lone saguaro stood like a sentinel. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the distance, pitched to be heard by anyone who might be listening. "Malachi Brooks," he called. "You have taken something that belongs to me. Return my daughter, and you will live to see another sunset." Malachi stepped onto his porch, Winchester cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Ayanna's labored breathing mixing with the morning wind through the mesquite. She was still alive, still fighting. That had to count for something. "Your daughter came to me wounded," he called back. "I'm tending her injuries, nothing more." Takoda's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass scattered on stone. "You lie, white man. You have defiled her and would keep her as your slave. This is why she ran from our camp. This is why she bleeds." Even from a distance, Malachi could see the calculation in the chief's eyes, cold as a rattlesnake's. This wasn't about rescue or justice. This was about silence. About making sure whatever Ayanna had seen would die with her buried deep as secrets in the desert sand. Come closer." Malachi said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine like a scorpion. "Let's talk like civilized men." But Dakota was already wheeling his horse around, riding back toward his warriors, whose war paint gleamed like fresh blood in the rising sun. The morning air grew thick with coming heat, throwing long shadows across the alkali flats where barrel cactus and prickly pear created their own miniature fortresses. And in those shadows, Malachi could see the shape of his own death approaching on painted ponies. The cabin fell silent except for Ayanna's shallow breathing and the distant murmur of Comanche voices carrying on the desert wind like ancient chants. Malachi moved away from the window, his mind cataloging defensive positions and escape routes, with the precision of a man who'd spent too many years in uniform, dodging Apache bullets and cavalry politics in equal measure. The limestone bluff behind the cabin would prevent flanking from the rear, but it also cut off his retreat. He'd built himself a fortress that was also a trap like so many other choices in his life since Sarah died. He'd been 28 when the Army discharged him a decorated cavalry officer with commendations for bravery and a dead wife and daughter who looked at him like he was a stranger wearing their father's face. The frontier had taken Margaret during a cholera outbreak at Fort Davidson, and Sarah had never forgiven him for the military life that kept them moving from one disease-ridden outpost to another, like tumbleweeds blown by military necessity. "You chose them over us," she'd said during one of their last arguments, her 12-year-old face fierce with accusation that cut deeper than any Apache lance. "You chose the uniform over your family." She'd been right, of course. The Army had been his calling, his identity, his reason for existing in a world that seemed determined to swallow decent folks whole. Until the day he'd carried her fever-racked body to yet another unmarked grave, and realized that everything he'd fought for meant nothing without someone to fight for. He'd resigned his commission that same week and headed west looking for empty country where a man could disappear like morning mist. The land around Dry Butte had been cheap because it was worthless, too dry for farming, too barren for good grazing, perfect for growing guilt and regret in the harsh desert soil. Water. Ayanna whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling silence. Malachi brought her a tin cup from his well supporting her head as she drank. The water was clean and cold, drawn from deep limestone springs that never ran dry even in the worst droughts. It was one of the few advantages of his chosen exile. He could survive a siege if he had to. "Tell me about your father," he said as she settled back against the pillow that still smelled faintly of Sarah's hair. Her eyes opened, focusing on his face with difficulty, like someone trying to see through desert shimmer. "He was not always this. When I was small, he saved wounded animals, taught me to read tracks in the sand, to know the language of the wind through the canyons." She paused, gathering strength like water pooling in rock. "But the white soldiers killed my mother, shot her while she gathered berries for winter storage. She was carrying my baby brother." Malachi felt his chest tighten like a rope around his ribs. He'd seen too much of this on both sides, the cycle of violence that fed on itself like wildfire, until everyone was either dead or too broken to remember why they'd started fighting. The Army sent letters. Ayanna continued, her voice growing stronger with memory's pain. "Said she was armed, dangerous. But I found her body among the manzanita bushes. No weapon, just berries in her basket, my brother still moving inside her like a trapped bird." "I'm sorry," Malachi said, and meant it with the weight of a man who'd written reports that sounded just like that sanitized versions of messy encounters that usually ended with someone innocent getting killed by frightened soldiers or bitter civilians. "My father, he changed. Started speaking of war, of driving all whites from our land like locusts before the desert wind." The young warriors listened. They were angry, hungry for revenge. that tasted sweeter than prickly pear fruit. Her breathing grew more labored. But anger makes men careless, makes them believe lies that taste better than truth. Through the window, Malachi could see the warriors spreading out like hunting coyotes, forming a loose circle around the cabin. Professional soldiers would have waited for nightfall, but these were raiders, not regulars. They'd learned fighting from a generation of warfare against an enemy that owned the desert like the Comanche owned their horses, and they fought like their ancestors with honor and fury in equal measure. 3 days ago, Ayanna continued. My father called for war council. Said white settlers had attacked our camp, killed 6 warriors. Said we must strike back before the moon grew full. She closed her eyes. But I followed him that night, saw where he really went. The wooden pendant felt heavy in Malachi's pocket, like a stone of judgment. He pulled it out, holding it up to the light that streamed through the window in golden shafts. The carving was crude but careful, a child's attempt at art that spoke of long winter evenings by firelight. The initials EH were scratched deep into the wood, as if someone had wanted to make sure they wouldn't wear away, like so many other things in this harsh land. Tell me about this, he said. Ayanna's eyes fixed on the pendant, and for a moment her face crumpled like a child's confronted with broken dreams. Emily Henderson, 8 years old. She was holding it when my father cut her throat. The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and Malachi felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not surprise exactly, but a deep, familiar nausea that came from recognizing evil wearing the mask of necessity. He'd seen what men could do to each other when they convinced themselves it was justified by some greater good. The Henderson family. Ayanna continued, her voice growing stronger with purpose, like a spring finding its source. They had a farm 20 miles north past the Red Rocks where eagles nest. New to the territory, trying to build something from nothing. My father went there with 12 warriors, not to raid, to murder. Why? Malachi asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer like a bitter taste. Because they were innocent. Because killing them would look like what white men expect from Indian savagery without reason. Her voice was bitter now, aged beyond her years like desert-cured leather. He made it look like a war party. Burned their cabin, took their scalps. Left sign that cavalry would follow like hounds following a scent trail. The pattern was sickeningly familiar, like recognizing your own face in a broken mirror. Malachi had tracked enough false flag operations during his army days to recognize the tactics create an atrocity that would justify retaliation and then use that retaliation to justify more violence. It was an old game played by men who'd forgotten that wars were supposed to have purpose beyond their own continuation. The little girl. Ayanna continued. She saw me watching from the brush where I hid like a coward. Called for her mama, but mama was already dead among the scattered corn they'd grown. She touched the bandage on her chest. I wanted to help her, but my father saw me. Knew I would not stay silent like stones in the desert. So he shot you. Said I was betraying our people. Said the whites would use my words to destroy us like they destroyed the buffalo herds. She met his eyes. But keeping silent would destroy us too. Make us into what he has become, monsters wearing war paint. Through the window, Malachi could see individual warriors, now young men with paint marking their faces in patterns that told stories of first battles and family honor, older fighters carrying repeating rifles that had probably been taken from dead soldiers in a dozen different fights. They were disciplined, patient, knowing their business, like desert predators, knowing when to strike. How many people know about the Henderson family? He asked. Only my father's closest warriors. And my cousin Kiyoshi, he speaks English, sometimes translates for the army when they want to talk peace while planning war. But he was not there. He thinks the whites attacked first. Would he believe you if you told him? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, like someone choosing words that might save or damn them all. Kiyoshi has honor, but he also has loyalty. My father saved his life when we were children, raised him like a son after the fever took his parents. Loyalty runs deep as underground springs. Malachi understood. Loyalty wasn't always a virtue. Sometimes it was just another kind of blindness, like staring into the sun until you couldn't see anything else. He'd seen good men follow bad orders because they couldn't imagine that their leaders were capable of evil. A voice called from outside, speaking in Comanche with the authority of command. Ayanna translated, "They are growing impatient. My father tells them you are holding me against my will, using me for your pleasure. What's your father's plan? Kill you. Kill me. Say you murdered a Comanche girl and we were forced to seek justice. Use it to justify attacks on other settlers like the Henderson family." She coughed, specks of blood appearing on her lips like crimson flowers. He needs war to hold the tribe together. Peace makes him ordinary, just another old man with stories of better days. The truth of it hit Malachi like a physical blow, recognizing the pattern he'd seen in too many officers who'd stayed at war too long. He'd met men like Dakota leaders who'd found their identity in conflict, who needed enemies to define themselves. Without war, they were just middle-aged men with nothing special to offer their followers. "There's a cavalry post at Fort Davidson," he said. 40 miles east, if we could get you there." I would not live to speak. My father's warriors know every trail, every hiding place between here and there. Ayanna's breathing was becoming more labored. "But if I die here, die telling the truth, maybe someone will listen. Maybe the lies will die with us." Malachi moved to the window again, watching the heat shimmer beginning to rise from the rocks like the breath of sleeping giants. The sun was climbing higher, and in a few hours the temperature would climb over 100 degrees. The warriors would be suffering in their war paint and heavy clothing, but they'd endure it like they endured everything else, with the patience of desert hunters. "Your cousin," he said. "Kiyoshi, he's out there." "Yes. The tall one with the white horse marked with handprints. He wears blue paint across his forehead, the mark of a treaty speaker." Malachi found the man she described sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up in the saddle, reading the desert like other men read books. Even from a distance, there was something different about him. Less rigid than the others, more thoughtful, like someone who asked questions instead of just following orders. "If I could get word to him, he would think you were lying, trying to divide us like the army tried to divide all the tribes." Ayanna struggled to sit up. "But if he heard it from me..." "You're in no condition to be moved. Then we bring him here." She met his eyes with the intensity of someone staking everything on a single throw. "My father expects you to cower, to bargain for your life. He does not expect you to invite his warriors into your home." It was insane. It was also the only plan that might work, like jumping across a canyon, because there was no other way forward. Malachi had learned during his cavalry days that the most dangerous thing about predictable enemies was that they expected you to be predictable too. "And what makes you think Kiyoshi will listen?" "Because he is not like the others. He questions. He remembers what we were before the killing began, when we fought to protect instead of fighting to destroy." She coughed again, more blood this time. "And because he loved my mother too. She was his father's sister." The family connections were complex, but Malachi understood the weight of them. In a tribal society, blood ties could override political loyalty, like water cutting through stone. If Kiyoshi had loved Ayanna's mother, he might be willing to hear the truth about her death. "How do we get him here without starting a war?" "Call for parley. Say you will negotiate for my return. Ask for one man to come inside, someone who speaks English." She closed her eyes, conserving energy like a desert animal in drought. "Kiyoshi will volunteer. He always does." It was a desperate plan, but Malachi had seen desperate plans work before when conventional wisdom failed. Sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation was to make it even more impossible, like setting a backfire to stop a wildfire. He checked his rifle again, counting the rounds like a miser counting coins. 43 bullets against 50 warriors. But if he could turn even one of them, if he could plant a seed of doubt in the desert soil of their certainty. "Ayanna," he said, "if this goes wrong, then I die knowing I spoke the truth. That is better than living with lies that poison everything they touch." Her words reminded him of something Sarah had said during her final delirium, when fever made her speak truths that cut deeper than Apache knives. "At least the fever is honest, Papa. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." He'd thought at the time that she was just rambling, her mind burned by disease. But now he wondered if she'd been trying to tell him something about the difference between honest enemies and dishonest friends. Malachi walked to the door, Winchester in hand. The morning sun was brutal now, turning the alkali flats into a furnace, where only the hardiest desert plants survived, cholla and barrel cactus standing like armed sentinels. The warriors sat their horses with stoic patience, but he could see the strain in their postures. They wanted this finished. So did he. "Chief Dakota," he called. "I would speak with you about terms." The words carried across the hard pan like a rifle shot, echoing off the limestone bluffs, where petroglyphs told stories of other wars, other desperate stands. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the stone formations, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead like a harbinger. Dakota sat his horse at the center of his warriors, a man carved from shadow and rage, painted for war with symbols that spoke of power and authority. Even at a distance, Malachi could see the calculation in his posture, the way he held himself like a coiled spring, ready to unleash violence at the first sign of weakness. "You would negotiate." Dakota's voice carried clearly pitched to be heard by every warrior in his band. "You hold my daughter against her will, and you speak of terms." "I speak of truth," Malachi replied, keeping his voice steady as stone. "Your daughter is wounded, needs medical care. I've given her that care, nothing more." "Lies." The word cracked like a whip across the desert air. "She would not have run from our camp unless you had already defiled her. This is the white man's way to take what is not given." Behind Dakota, the warriors shifted restlessly like horses before a storm. Some were young, barely out of boyhood, their faces painted with symbols that spoke of first battles and untested courage burning bright as desert stars. Others were older, scarred veterans who'd survived years of warfare, their eyes holding the flat deadness of men who'd seen too much death. All of them watched their chief with the devotion of men who'd found their identity in following him. But Malachi noticed something else. A tall warrior on a white horse, painted with black handprints, positioned slightly apart from the others, like a man keeping his own counsel. Kiyoshi, if Ayanna was right. He sat differently than the rest, less rigid, more thoughtful, like someone who listened before he spoke. And when Dakota spoke, Kiyoshi's eyes didn't fix on his chief, but on the cabin, as if he was trying to see through the adobe walls to whatever truth lay inside. "Send one man to verify her condition," Malachi called. "Someone who speaks English. Let him see for himself that she's being treated with respect." It was a calculated risk that could explode in his face like black powder in a lightning storm. If Dakota refused, it would raise questions among his warriors. If he agreed, it would mean allowing potential betrayal into his inner circle. Either way, it forced the chief to make a choice that revealed his true intentions. Dakota was quiet for a long moment, his horse stamping impatiently in the rising heat while the desert held its breath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of barely controlled fury. "You think to divide us with your tricks, white man. But we are not children to be fooled by honeyed words. I think to prevent bloodshed, Malachi replied. Your daughter is hurt. She needs rest, water, proper care. Send your man to see her and judge for yourself whether she's been harmed. Oh, she has been harmed. Dakota's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the canyon walls. Harmed by your presence, by your touch, by your very existence on land that belongs to her people. The words were meant to inflame, to stir the warriors to action, like wind stirring a grass fire. But Malachi noticed that several of them were looking at each other uncertainly, their war paint unable to hide their confusion. They'd come expecting to rescue a kidnapped girl, not to listen to speeches about territorial rights. And Kiyoshi was still watching the cabin, his expression unreadable as desert stone. One man, Malachi repeated. Let him come inside, speak with her judge for himself. If he finds evidence of wrongdoing, I'll surrender myself to your justice. But if he finds only a wounded girl receiving medical care, then what? Dakota's voice was sharp with suspicion. Then maybe we can find a way to settle this without more blood on the ground. It was a dangerous gambit, but Malachi had learned during his army days that the best way to defeat an enemy was to make him defeat himself. Dakota was lying, and lies required constant maintenance, like a garden in drought. The more pressure applied, the more likely they were to crack. Behind the chief, the warriors were murmuring among themselves like wind through canyon stone. Malachi caught fragments of Comanche, not enough to understand the words, but enough to read the tone. They were asking questions, expressing doubt. The seed of uncertainty had been planted in desert soil. Father, a voice called from the cabin. Ayana had managed to get to her feet, was standing in the doorway, supported by the frame like a wounded bird refusing to fall. Her face was pale as bone, bleached by desert sun, but her voice carried clearly. I am here. I am alive. The sight of her seemed to strike the warriors like a physical blow. She was obviously wounded, obviously weak, but she was standing on her own power. She didn't look like someone who'd been ravaged or tortured. Ayana. Dakota's voice cracked like a whip. Come away from that place. Come to your father. But Ayana didn't move. She stood in the doorway, swaying slightly like a tree in wind, her dark eyes fixed on her father, with an expression Malachi couldn't read. I am safe here, Father. This man saved my life. Saved you from what? Dakota demanded. Who wounded you, daughter? The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. And Malachi felt time slow to a crawl. This was the moment, the point where truth and lies would meet like opposing cavalry charges, and only one would survive. Ayana's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the alkali flats like thunder rolling through canyons. You did, Father. You shot me because I saw what you did to the Henderson family. The words hit the assembled warriors like a flash flood hitting a dry creek bed. Horses shied, men reached for weapons, voices rose in confusion and anger. But Dakota's reaction was the most telling for just a moment. His mask slipped like war paint running in rain, and Malachi saw the cold fury beneath. You are delirious. Dakota said, his voice steady but strained like a rope near breaking. The fever has addled your mind. You do not know what you are saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Ayana took a step forward, and Malachi moved to support her. I saw you kill Emily Henderson. I saw you cut her throat while she begged for her mother. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the desert itself had stopped breathing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the world to choose its direction. It was Kiyoshi who broke it, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. What is she saying? Dakota wheeled his horse to face his nephew, and Malachi saw something like panic flicker across his features, like lightning across a night sky. She speaks lies, brought on by fever and the white man's poison. She does not know. I know that Emily Henderson was 8 years old. Ayanna interrupted, her voice gaining strength like a spring finding water. I know that she had yellow hair like corn silk and blue eyes like summer sky. I know that she was wearing a blue dress with tiny flowers when you killed her. The details were like hammer blows on an anvil, each one driving deeper into the silence. Malachi could see the effect on the warriors, the way their certainty began to crumble like adobe in a flash flood, replaced by confusion and growing doubt. I know that she carved this pendant with her own hands. Ayanna continued, holding up the wooden horse. I know that it was still in her fingers when you scalped her. Kiyoshi's horse moved forward, carrying him closer to the cabin like a man drawn to water in the desert. Show me, he said in English, his voice rough with emotion. Dakota's voice cracked like a whip. You will not listen to these lies. She is sick, confused. The white man has filled her head with poison. But Kiyoshi was already dismounting his movements, careful and deliberate. He was a big man, Malachi realized, taller than most of his companions, with the kind of presence that came from natural authority rather than enforced dominance, a leader, not just a follower. If she lies, Kiyoshi said, still speaking English, then I will know. But I will hear her words with my own ears. Not you will not. Dakota's facade was cracking now, his voice rising to a shout that echoed off the canyon walls. I am your chief, I command you to. You are my uncle. Kiyoshi replied, his voice steady as stone. But you are not my conscience. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Malachi felt the entire dynamic shift like a landslide beginning. This was no longer just about a wounded girl and her accusations. This was about the nature of leadership, about the difference between authority and tyranny. Dakota's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. If you take one step toward that cabin, you betray your own people. You choose the white man's lies over your family's honor. I choose truth over lies, Kiyoshi said simply, as my aunt would have wanted. The mention of Ayanna's mother hit Dakota like a physical blow. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Malachi saw the rage beneath, not the righteous anger of a protective father, but the cold fury of a man whose careful plans were coming apart like rope in a fire. Your aunt died because of white treachery, Dakota snarled. Would you dishonor her memory by listening to more white lies? My aunt died because soldiers shot an unarmed woman, Kiyoshi replied. But that does not give us the right to murder innocent children. The words were like a knife thrust, precise and devastating. Around them, the other warriors were beginning to stir voices, rising in confusion and growing anger. Some were shouting support for their chief, others demanding answers, still others simply trying to understand what was happening to their world. Malachi felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the whole thing would explode into violence, like a powder keg near fire. But Ayanna was still standing still, breathing, still willing to speak truth in the face of death. Come, she said to Kiyoshi, her voice carrying despite its weakness. Come and hear what your chief has done in your name. Kiyoshi took a step toward the cabin, and Malachi heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. Rifles cocked, arrows knocked, the leather whisper of knives being drawn. The warriors were preparing for war, but they were no longer united in their purpose. Stop! Dakota's voice was a roar of fury that seemed to shake the very stones. I will not allow this betrayal. But Kiyoshi didn't stop. He walked forward with measured steps, his hand resting on his knife, but not drawing it. Around him, the tension ratcheted higher with each footfall, until the air itself seemed to hum with impending violence, like the moment before lightning strikes. Tell me, he said to Ayanna when he reached the porch. Tell me what you saw. And as the sun climbed higher into the brutal sky, casting sharp shadows across the alkali flats, where a saguaro and barrel cactus stood like silent witnesses. Ayanna began to speak. Her voice was weak but clear, carrying the weight of terrible truth across the silence, like water carrying seeds to new ground. The Henderson family had been building a life from nothing, like so many others drawn to this harsh land by dreams of something better. 3 children, 2 parents, a small farm carved from the wilderness, with nothing but determination and hope. They'd been kind to the few Indians they'd encountered, had even shared food with a hungry Comanche hunting party the previous winter, when game was scarce and bellies empty. That kindness, Ayanna explained, had been their death sentence. Because Dakota needed innocent victims, needed an atrocity that would look like unprovoked Indian savagery. The Hendersons had been perfect, isolated, defenseless, and most importantly, blameless as newborn lambs. They did not even fight back, she whispered. The father tried to protect his family, but he had no weapons. The mother begged for her children's lives on her knees. And little Emily. She held up the wooden pendant, her hands shaking like aspen leaves in wind. She was hiding under the bed, when I could have warned her, could have saved her. But I was afraid. Afraid of what my father would do if he knew I was watching his work. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, and Malachi could see its effect on Kiyoshi. The big warrior's face was stone, but his eyes burned with a mixture of rage and grief that spoke of a man having his worldview torn apart like paper in a gale. "You are certain?" Kiyoshi asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am certain," Ayanna replied, "and I am dying because of it." The words were simple, final, and absolutely devastating. Because everyone present knew they were true. The bullet hole in Ayanna's back, the fever burning in her eyes, the way she swayed on her feet like a tree in a storm, all of it spoke to a girl who'd been shot for speaking truth. Behind them, Dakota's voice rose in a final desperate attempt to regain control. "She lies. She has been corrupted by the white man's poison. Do not listen to her words." But the damage was done. Kiyoshi turned slowly, deliberately, to face his chief. When he spoke, his voice carried across the alkali flats with the finality of a funeral dirge. "You shot your own daughter." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a judgment, and a sentence all rolled into one. And in the silence that followed, Malachi could hear the sound of a man's authority crumbling like sandstone in a flash flood. The accusation hung in the scorching air like a blade poised to fall. And for a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen in amber. 50 warriors sat their horses in perfect stillness, their eyes fixed on the tableau before them, a wounded girl, a white man, and a war chief whose careful lies were unraveling like rope in fire. Dakota's response was swift and brutal. "Kiyoshi!" He roared, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "You forget yourself, you forget your place." But Kiyoshi didn't flinch. He stood on Malachi's porch like a man who'd found solid ground after years of walking on quicksand. "My place is with truth. My aunt taught me that before the soldiers killed her. Your aunt would weep to see you betraying your own people for white lies. My aunt would weep to see what you've made of her people." Kiyoshi replied, his voice steady as granite. "She would weep to know that we murder children and call it honor." The words struck the assembled warriors like physical blows. Malachi could see the effect rippling through their ranks, confusion, anger, dawning horror. These were men who'd followed Dakota because they believed in his righteousness, his vision of justice. Now that vision was cracking before their eyes like dried clay. "You dare speak of honor?" Dakota's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's agitation. "You who would believe the words of a sick girl over the wisdom of your chief." "I believe the evidence of my eyes," Kiyoshi said, gesturing toward Ayanna. "She bears the wounds of someone shot from behind, shot by someone she trusted enough to turn her back on." The observation was simple, clinical, and utterly damning. Everyone present could see the truth of it, the bullet hole in Ayana's shoulder blade, the way she favored her left side, the fever that spoke of infection setting in like poison. Wounds can be self-inflicted, Dakota said, but his voice lacked conviction. She could have shot herself to make her lies more believable. With what weapon? Kiyoshi asked. And why would she ride 20 miles bleeding to death just to tell lies to a white man? The questions were logical, devastating, and unanswerable. Malachi could see Dakota's story falling apart piece by piece, like a house built on sand when the flood comes. But he also knew that cornered animals were the most dangerous, and Dakota was nothing if not dangerous. Enough! The chief shouted, his voice cracking with rage. You have heard enough lies. We came here to rescue my daughter, not to listen to white poison. He wheeled his horse to face his warriors. And Malachi saw the moment when desperation replaced calculation in his eyes. My brothers, this white man has corrupted my daughter's mind, turned her against her own people. He has used medicine and magic to make her speak lies. The words were clearly meant to inflame, to stir the warriors to action before doubt could take deeper root. And they might have worked if not for the pendant in Ayana's hand. Father, she said, her voice carrying despite its weakness. If I lie, then how do I know about the wooden horse? How do I know that Emily Henderson carved it herself, that she was working on it when you came to her family's cabin? The detail hit like a thunderbolt. Several warriors leaned forward in their saddles, straining to hear. The pendant was real, tangible evidence that couldn't be explained away by fever or white man's poison. Show them, Kiyoshi said quietly, his eyes never leaving Dakota's face. Show them the carving. Ayana held up the wooden horse, and even from a distance, the warriors could see the careful workmanship, the child's initials carved deep into the wood. It was exactly the kind of toy a frontier child might make during long winter evenings, whittling by firelight, while her parents told stories of the world beyond the desert. E.H. Ayana said, her voice carrying across the silence. Emily Henderson. She was making it for her little brother's birthday. The specificity of the details was devastating. Names, ages, relationships, information that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd witnessed the murders firsthand. Where did you get this? One of the younger warriors called out, his voice tight with growing suspicion. From the cabin where my father killed her, Ayana replied. It was still clutched in her hand when he scalped her. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled men. Malachi could see the effect on their faces, the way certainty gave way to doubt, the way loyalty began to crack under the weight of evidence. But Dakota wasn't finished. With the desperate cunning of a man fighting for his life, he played his final card. You speak of evidence, he said, his voice carrying new authority. But what of the evidence of your own eyes? What of the scalps taken from our own people by white soldiers? He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch, holding it high for all to see. The hair of our brothers and sisters, taken by the same soldiers this man once served. Will you forget their deaths to believe the lies of a sick girl? The scalps were real enough. Malachi could see the dark hair, the distinctive way it had been cut, but something about them struck him as wrong, though he couldn't immediately place what. Those scalps, Ayana said, her voice growing stronger with anger. Where did you get them, Father? From the bodies of our people murdered by... From the bodies you dug up? She interrupted. From the old burial ground by Willow Creek. I saw you there 3 nights ago with your shovel and your lies. The accusation was like a physical blow. Dakota's face went white, then red, then white again. Around him, his warriors began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in confusion and growing anger. That you desecrated the dead. Kiyoshi's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute horror. You disturbed the rest of our ancestors to support your lies. I did what was necessary. Dakota's mask finally slipped, completely revealing the desperate fury beneath. I did what needed to be done to protect our people. You murdered children to start a war. Ayana's voice rose to a shout, and the effort cost her dearly. She swayed on her feet, and Malachi moved to support her. You desecrated the dead to hide your crimes. You shot your own daughter to keep her silent. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Malachi could see their effect on the warriors. Some were reaching for weapons, but they no longer seemed certain who the enemy was. Others were backing their horses away, as if trying to distance themselves from the horror being revealed. But then Malachi noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the warriors, one figure was moving differently, a young man, with distinctive white paint across his cheekbones. Nalnish Dakota's war chief, the one Ayana had warned him about. He was positioning himself for something, his hand moving slowly toward his rifle. "A Kiyoshi," Malachi said quietly. "We have company." Before anyone could react, Nalnish raised his rifle and fired. The bullet took Kiyoshi in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. In the same instant, Nalnish spurred his horse forward, war cry splitting the air. "For the true chief," he shouted. "Death to traitors!" The camp exploded into chaos. Warriors who'd been questioning their leader suddenly found themselves choosing sides in a civil war that had erupted without warning. Some followed Nalnish's lead, others moved to protect Kiyoshi. Still others simply tried to get clear of the sudden violence. Malachi grabbed Ayana and pulled her into the cabin as bullets began flying. Through the window, he could see the warriors splitting into two groups, those still loyal to Dakota, and those who'd chosen to follow Kiyoshi despite his wound. "This is bad," he said, checking his rifle. "This is real bad." "No," Ayana replied, her voice steady despite her weakness. "This is necessary. The poison had to come out before it killed everyone." Outside, the battle was brief but vicious. The warriors who'd followed Dakota were outnumbered, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending the indefensible. Those who'd chosen Kiyoshi fought with the righteous fury of men who discovered they'd been betrayed. When the shooting stopped, 6 men lay dead on the alkali flats, including Nalnish, who'd taken a lance through the heart. Dakota himself was wounded and captured, his authority finally broken like a stick across the knee of truth. The cost of justice, Malachi reflected, was always higher than the cost of lies, but it was a cost that had to be paid, or the lies would eventually consume everything worth saving. Kiyoshi appeared in the doorway, his arm in a makeshift sling, but his eyes bright with determination. "It is finished," he said. "My uncle will face justice for what he has done." "What kind of justice?" Malachi asked. "The kind that comes from his own people," Kiyoshi replied. "The kind that cannot be questioned or ignored." Through the window, Malachi could see the surviving warriors binding Dakota's wounds. They were not gentle about it, but they were not cruel either. They were simply men doing what needed to be done, no matter how much it cost them. "The Henderson family," Ayana said, her voice barely audible. "They deserve to be buried properly, with prayers and dignity. And they will be," Kiyoshi promised. "And their story will be told so that others know they died as innocents, not as enemies." But as Malachi was tending to Ayana's wounds, he noticed something troubling. Through the window, he could see one of the warriors, a man he recognized as Sergeant Cord Walker, a scout for the cavalry, who sometimes worked with the Comanche. Walker was speaking quietly with 2 of Dakota's former followers, their body language tense and secretive. "Ayana," he said quietly, "we may have another problem." She followed his gaze, and her face went pale. "Walker. He was supposed to be scouting for the cavalry, but I've seen him in my father's camp many times. Too many times. What's he doing here?" "What desperate men always do," He's making new alliances, finding new ways to profit from conflict. The prospect hung over them like a storm cloud. They had exposed Dakota's conspiracy, but in doing so they had revealed something larger, a network of corruption that reached beyond tribal politics, into the very heart of the territorial government. "How many people know about the other families?" Malachi asked, remembering the list they'd seen. "Too many. And Walker knows all the same trails we do, all the same hiding places." As if summoned by her words, Walker approached the cabin, his face set in the kind of false friendliness that made Malachi's skin crawl. "Brooks," he called out. "Heard you've had some excitement out here." "Nothing we couldn't handle." Malachi replied, his hand moving to his gun. "I'm sure. But I got word from Fort Davidson. Colonel Morrison wants to see you. Something about a report you need to make." The name hit Malachi like a physical blow. Morrison, the commanding officer at Fort Davidson, the man they'd been planning to report to. But now, with Walker's obvious connection to Dakota, he wondered how deep the corruption really went. "Tell the colonel I'll be along directly," Malachi said. "He's actually on his way here. Should arrive within the hour with a full patrol. Wants to hear your story firsthand." Walker's smile was like a snake's, all teeth and no warmth. "Course he's particularly interested in what happened to those letters Chief Dakota was supposed to have. Some folks in the territorial government are mighty concerned about certain communications that might have gone missing." The threat was clear as desert air. Morrison wasn't coming to investigate, he was coming to clean up loose ends. And Malachi, Ayanna, and Kiyoshi were the loosest ends of all. "But we need to move," Malachi said after Walker rode away. "Now." "Where?" Ayanna asked. "Somewhere Morrison doesn't expect us to go. Somewhere we can figure out how deep this conspiracy really goes." As they prepared to leave, Kiyoshi approached with troubling news. "My warriors found something in my uncle's belongings, papers, letters written in English." He handed Malachi a bundle of documents, and Malachi's blood ran cold as he read. The letters were signed by Colonel Morrison, detailing planned attacks on specific settler families' payment schedules for manufactured atrocities, and worst of all, a complete list of territorial officials who were profiting from the Indian Wars. "Jesus Christ," Malachi whispered. "This goes all the way to the top." "What do we do?" Ayanna asked. "We expose it all, whatever it takes." But even as he said it, Malachi could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Morrison was coming, and he was bringing enough men to make sure no witnesses survived to tell the truth. The next few hours would determine whether justice would prevail or whether corruption would bury the truth as deep as Emily Henderson's grave. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to flee into the desert, Malachi felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was the keeper of secrets that could save or damn an entire territory. The conspiracy was larger than they'd imagined, more dangerous than they'd feared, but it could be stopped. It would be stopped if they could survive long enough to expose it. Looking at his companions, Ayanna wounded but unbroken, and Kiyoshi, who'd chosen truth over tribal loyalty, Malachi knew they had a chance. A slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. The desert was vast, unforgiving, full of hiding places for those who knew how to use them. And Malachi was beginning to remember skills he'd thought he'd lost forever, the ability to track, to hide, to survive in hostile territory, with nothing but determination and the will to see justice done. As they rode away from the cabin, leaving behind the only home Malachi had known for 8 years, he thought about Sarah. She would have been proud of him, he realized. Proud that he'd finally found something worth fighting for again. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, promising another day of brutal heat. But somewhere ahead lay the possibility of justice. The chance to expose the truth, the hope that Emily Henderson's death would not be meaningless. It was enough. It would have to be enough. The desert heat was already brutal, as they pushed their horses hard across the alkali flats, heading toward a network of canyons that Kiyoshi knew from his childhood. Behind them, dust clouds marked Morrison's approach, at least 20 riders moving fast and with purpose. "How much time do we have?" Ayana asked, her face pale from pain and exertion. "Not enough," Malachi replied, studying the terrain ahead. The canyons offered concealment, but they could also become a trap if Morrison's men knew the area well enough. There, Kiyoshi pointed toward a narrow gap between two sandstone cliffs. "Devil's Throat. It leads to a maze of passages, but some are dead ends." "You know the way through?" "I think so, but if I'm wrong, then we die trying instead of dying running." They plunged into the canyon system as the first rifle shots echoed behind them. The passage was barely wide enough for a horse with walls that rose sheer on both sides, like the ribs of some ancient beast. The sound of hoofbeats echoed strangely in the confined space, making it impossible to tell how close their pursuers might be. "Left here," Kiyoshi called, leading them into an even narrower passage. "This connects to the main canyon system." But as they rounded a bend, Malachi's heart sank. The passage ended in a sheer wall of rock, with only a small opening near the top that might admit a man on foot, but never a horse. "A dead end," he said. "No." Kiyoshi dismounted and began examining the rock face. "There's another way. A passage behind that rock fall, but we'll have to go on foot." They could hear voices now echoing through the canyon system. Morrison's men had followed them into the maze, and they were spreading out, searching methodically. "Can Ayana make it?" Malachi asked, noting the way she swayed in her saddle. "I can make it," she said firmly. "I've come too far to quit now." They abandoned their horses and squeezed through the narrow opening Kiyoshi had found. The passage beyond was a natural tunnel carved by ancient water, barely wide enough for a person, and pitch black after the first few yards. "Stay close," Kiyoshi whispered. The passage split several times, and not all of them lead anywhere good. They felt their way through the darkness, guided only by Kiyoshi's childhood memories and the faint movement of air that suggested an exit somewhere ahead. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's men discovering their abandoned horses' voices growing louder as the search intensified. "This way," Kiyoshi breathed, leading them down a side passage that sloped steeply downward. "This should come out near the old Apache camp." The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the heart of the mesa. Malachi found himself thinking of Sarah, wondering if she would have had the courage to crawl through this nightmare of stone and darkness. But then he thought of Emily Henderson, and he knew he had to keep going. Finally, blessedly, they saw light ahead. Not the harsh glare of desert sun, but the softer glow of daylight filtered through vegetation. The passage opened onto a hidden valley, small and green, fed by an underground spring that created an oasis in the desert. "My grandfather brought me here once," Kiyoshi said. "Said it was a sacred place where the spirits of water lived." It was certainly beautiful cottonwood trees providing shade grass that was actually green water that ran clear and cold. After the brutal heat of the desert and the claustrophobic darkness of the passage, it felt like paradise. But even paradise had its dangers. As they emerged into the valley, Malachi caught a glint of sunlight on metal from the rocks above. "Down!" he shouted, diving behind a fallen log as rifle fire erupted from 3 different positions. Morrison had anticipated their route, had sent men around to cut off their escape. They were trapped in the valley with nowhere to run and precious little cover. "How many?" Kiyoshi asked, peering carefully over their makeshift barricade. "At least 6, Malachi replied, counting muzzle flashes. "Maybe more. They've got us in a crossfire." Ayana was pale but alert, checking the rifle she'd taken from one of Takoda's warriors. "How much ammunition do we have?" "Not enough for a long fight." The tactical situation was grim. Their enemies held the high ground, had superior numbers, and could afford to wait them out. Meanwhile, Ayanna was growing weaker by the hour, and the heat was taking its toll on all of them. Not there. Kiyoshi pointed to a cluster of boulders near the spring. If we can reach those rocks, we'll have better cover and access to water. It's 30 yards of open ground. Then we make it fast. Malachi looked at Ayanna, saw the determination in her eyes despite the pain. Can you run? I can do whatever's necessary. They broke cover together, sprinting across the open ground as rifles cracked from above. Bullets whined past them, kicking up spurts of dust and chipping bark from the cottonwoods. Malachi felt one bullet tug at his sleeve, another pass so close to his head that he could feel the wind of its passage. They reached the boulders just as a new voice called out from above Morrison himself, arriving with reinforcements. "Hey, Brooks, I know you're down there. Let's talk like civilized men." "Want nothing to talk about, Morrison," Malachi called back. "We know about your deals with Dakota. We know about the families you marked for death." Morrison's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "You don't know anything, Brooks. You're just a broken-down drunk playing at being a hero. But it's over now. Surrender the girl and the letters, and I might let you live long enough to stand trial." "What trial? You planning to let us testify about your conspiracy?" "No, Brooks. I'm planning to let you confess to murdering a Comanche girl and her cousin. Tragic story, a deranged ex-cavalry officer who couldn't handle civilian life. Took out his frustrations on some innocent Indians. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Morrison would eliminate the witnesses and rewrite the story to suit his needs. The truth would be buried along with the people who knew it. "The letters are already gone," Ayanna called out. "Hidden where you'll never find them. Kill us and they'll surface anyway." It was a bluff, but a good one. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating the odds. "Where?" he finally demanded. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere that if we don't return by sunset, they'll be delivered to the territorial governor and the Army headquarters in Santa Fe." Another silence, longer this time. Then Morrison's voice cold with fury. "You're lying. But it doesn't matter. I'll find those letters and I'll find whoever you gave them to. This territory needs the kind of firm leadership I can provide, and I won't let some misguided idealists interfere with progress." "Progress," Kiyoshi called out. "You call murdering children progress. I call ending the Indian problem once and for all progress. I call bringing civilization to this wilderness progress. And if that requires some hard choices, some necessary sacrifices, then so be it." The mask was off now. Morrison was revealing himself as the kind of man who would justify any atrocity in the name of manifest destiny. He wasn't just corrupt, he was a true believer in his own twisted vision of the future. "And last chance, Brooks," Morrison shouted. "Surrender now or we come down there and take you." "Come ahead," Malachi replied. "We'll be waiting." The assault began immediately. Morrison's men started working their way down into the valley, using every scrap of cover, coordinating their movements with military precision. These weren't just hired guns. They were soldiers trained and disciplined. The fight that followed was unlike anything Malachi had experienced during his cavalry days. This wasn't a formal engagement between armies. It was a desperate struggle between people who'd chosen different definitions of justice, different visions of what America should become. Malachi found himself remembering skills he'd thought he'd forgotten: how to read terrain, how to anticipate an enemy's movements, how to make every shot count when ammunition was scarce. Beside him, Kiyoshi fought with the fluid grace of a warrior born to the desert, and Ayanna, despite her wounds, proved surprisingly deadly with a rifle. But they were outnumbered 3-1, and their enemies had all the advantages. One by one, Morrison's men worked closer, using fire and movement to advance, despite the defenders' best efforts. "We can't hold them much longer," Malachi said, noting how low their ammunition was running. "Then we make our last shots count," Ayanna replied. It was then that they heard it, the sound that Malachi had given up hope of hearing. Bugle calls echoing off the canyon walls. The cavalry was coming. But whose cavalry, Morrison's men or someone else? The answer came in the form of a voice calling down from the canyon rim, "U.S. cavalry, throw down your weapons." Morrison's response was immediate. "This is Colonel Morrison, Fort Davidson. These people are dangerous fugitives. I order you to assist in their capture." But the voice that answered wasn't what Morrison expected. "Colonel Morrison, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and murder. Surrender immediately." The tables had turned. Somehow word of Morrison's conspiracy had reached the right people. The cavalry wasn't here to arrest Malachi and his companions. They were here to arrest Morrison. The corrupt colonel's response was predictable. "Attack!" he screamed to his men. "Kill them all." No witnesses, but his men were no longer certain who they should be fighting. Some continued to attack the defenders, others began shooting at the cavalry, still others simply tried to escape the chaos. In the confusion, Malachi saw his chance. He broke cover and charged toward Morrison's position, Kiyoshi and Ayanna close behind, despite her wounds. It was a desperate gambit, but their only hope of ending this once and for all. Morrison saw them coming and raised his rifle, but Malachi was faster. His shot took the colonel in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. The corrupt officer landed hard at the bottom of the canyon, his rifle skittering away across the stone. As Malachi approached, Morrison looked up at him with hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you've won something?" Morrison gasped. "You think this changes anything?" "There are others, Brooks, others who share my vision. They'll continue the work." "Maybe," Malachi replied, "but you won't be around to see it." Morrison tried to speak again, but blood filled his mouth. He died there in the hidden valley, surrounded by the natural beauty he'd been willing to destroy in pursuit of his twisted goals. As the shooting died away and the cavalry secured the area, Malachi found himself thinking about justice and its costs. Morrison was dead. His immediate conspiracy was broken. But the larger problems remained. There would always be men who sought to profit from conflict, always those who would sacrifice innocent lives for personal gain. But there would also always be people willing to stand against them, willing to risk everything for the sake of truth and justice. People like Ayanna, who'd risked her life to expose her father's crimes. People like Kiyoshi, who'd chosen truth over tribal loyalty. People like the cavalry officers who'd chosen to investigate Morrison's activities instead of blindly following orders. "Is it over?" Ayanna asked, her voice weak but hopeful. "This part is over," Malachi replied, "but the work continues." 6 months later, Malachi stood in the cemetery at Fort Davidson, placing a small wooden horse on a freshly carved headstone. The grave belonged to Emily Henderson, her body finally recovered from the shallow pit where Dakota had left it, now laid to rest with the dignity she deserved in life. Emily Henderson, he read aloud from the stone. Age 8, beloved daughter and sister, her truth set others free. The inscription had been Ayanna's idea, a way to honor not just the child's life, but the purpose her death had ultimately served. The pendant, Emily's pendant, had been carved into the stone itself, a permanent reminder of innocence lost and justice found. The conspiracy had been larger than they'd imagined, reaching into territorial government, Army command, and federal agencies. But it had also been more fragile than its architects had believed. Once exposed to the light of truth, it had crumbled like a house built on sand. 17 officers had been court-martialed, including Morrison's successor, who'd tried to cover up the evidence. 12 contractors had lost their government privileges and faced criminal charges. And new oversight procedures had been implemented across all frontier commands. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless. The families on Morrison's list had been warned and protected. The survivors of the conspiracy had been brought to account. And the truth about what had happened had been preserved for future generations. "You did good, little one," Malachi whispered to the grave. You helped save a lot of people. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his solitude. He turned to see Ayanna walking carefully but steadily up the hill. She'd made remarkable progress in her recovery, both physical and emotional, and had become a powerful advocate for peace and reconciliation. "I brought flowers," she said, placing a small bouquet on Emily's grave. Wild roses from the hills where she used to play. The gesture was simple, but profound. A connection between the living and the dead, between the past and the future. Emily Henderson had died as a pawn in someone else's game, but she was remembered as a person, as a child, who deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect her. "Her parents' graves are in the same cemetery," Ayanna said. "I visited them this morning, told them that their daughter's death had meaning, that it helped save other families from the same fate. Do you think they can hear you? I think they can rest easier, knowing that their deaths weren't meaningless, that their daughter's courage, even in death, helped stop other children from suffering the same fate." They stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cemetery was peaceful, shaded by cottonwood trees that rustled in the afternoon breeze. It was a place of endings, but also of beginnings of memory transformed into purpose. 2 years later, as Malachi investigated a land fraud case in Denver, he received an unexpected visitor. The man who knocked on his hotel room door was tall, weathered, with the kind of face that spoke of hard living and harder choices. He introduced himself as Thomas Henderson, Emily's uncle, the brother of the father who died in Dakota's massacre. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ever since I heard about what you did, about how you exposed the men who killed my family." Henderson reached into his bag and pulled out a small wooden box, ornately carved and obviously old. This belonged to Emily's grandmother, came over from Ireland with the family. Emily used to keep her treasures in it, pretty rocks, pressed flowers, little things that mattered to her. He opened the box to reveal a collection of small objects, a child's ring, a lock of blonde hair, a dried flower, and at the bottom, a photograph. The picture showed a family of 5 standing in front of a small cabin, smiling at the camera, with the kind of hope that only comes from believing in the future. "I want you to have this," Henderson said, pulling out a small piece of paper folded and yellowed with age. "It's a letter Emily wrote to her grandmother just before she died. She never got to send it, but I think you should read it." Malachi unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the childish handwriting. The letter was simple, innocent, full of the kind of observations that only children make. "Dear Grandma," it began, "we are doing good on the farm. Papa says we might have enough corn this year to sell some in town. Mama is teaching me to read better. I made a horse out of wood for baby brother. I hope when you see us in heaven you will be proud of what we built here. Love, Emily." The words were devastating in their simplicity, their innocence, their assumption that there would be time for all the things that mattered. Emily had died believing in tomorrow, planning for a future that would never come. She was going to be a teacher, Henderson said quietly, always talking about the school she wanted to build, the children she wanted to help. She had such dreams. She did help children. Malachi said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her death exposed a conspiracy that would have killed dozens of other families. She saved lives, even though she never knew it. After Henderson left, Malachi sat alone in his hotel room, holding Emily's letter and thinking about the strange ways that tragedy could transform into triumph. The little girl who died clutching a wooden horse had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the darkest evils could be defeated by the simple act of telling the truth. The work would continue. There would always be more corruption to expose, more injustice to fight, more innocent people to protect. But now, Malachi knew that the work was part of something larger, something that connected him to Emily Henderson and Sarah Brooks, and all the other children who deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect them. He was no longer just a man hunting corrupt officials. He was a guardian of innocence, a protector of dreams, a keeper of promises made to the dead and the living alike. It was a responsibility he carried with pride, a burden he bore with honor, a mission he would continue until his final breath. The wooden horse that Ayanna had carved for him sat on his nightstand, catching the lamplight, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new investigations, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, Malachi Brooks slept peacefully, knowing that his life had meaning, that his work had purpose, that his daughter's death had taught him how to save other children. The frontier was still dangerous, still full of corruption and injustice. But it was also full of hope, full of people who chose to fight for what was right instead of what was profitable. People like Ayanna, who'd rebuilt her life and was now working to heal the wounds between her people and the white settlers. People like Kiyoshi, who'd become a respected leader, advocating for peaceful coexistence. People like Thomas Henderson, who turned his grief into purpose by building schools in his niece's memory. And in the end, that hope was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, Malachi received a letter that would change everything. It came from a young woman named Rebecca Martinez, writing from a small town in Arizona Territory. Her family had been targeted by a new conspiracy, one that involved mining companies, territorial officials, and a corrupt army captain who was selling weapons to both sides of an Apache conflict. Mr. Brooks. The letter read, "I've heard about your work exposing corruption. My family is in danger, and the local authorities are part of the problem. You're our only hope." Attached to the letter was a child's drawing, a picture of a family standing in front of a small adobe house, with mountains in the background and the sun shining overhead. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Please help us." Malachi looked at the drawing for a long time, thinking about Emily Henderson and Sarah Brooks, and all the children who died because adults had failed them. Then he folded the letter, carefully packed his belongings, and prepared for another journey. The work was never finished. There would always be more corruption to expose, more innocent people to protect, more battles to fight against those who would sacrifice others for their own gain. But that was what made the work meaningful, not its completion, but its continuation. As he rode out of Denver toward Arizona Territory, carrying his burden of responsibility and hope, Malachi felt the presence of all those who'd come before. Sarah, whose death had taught him the true cost of failure. Emily Henderson, whose murder had shown him the price of silence. Ayanna, whose courage had reminded him that speaking truth was worth any risk. They rode with him now, invisible, but undeniable, a reminder that some fights were worth fighting regardless of the odds. That some truths were worth dying for. That some children deserved to grow up in a world where adults chose justice over profit, courage over comfort, hope over fear. The sun was setting behind him as he rode toward his next assignment, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead lay new challenges, new conspiracies, new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of innocent people. It was good work, necessary work, work that gave meaning to loss and purpose to pain. The territorial frontier was vast and dangerous, full of men who would kill for money and power. But it was also full of people willing to stand against them, willing to risk everything for the sake of something larger than themselves. And as long as there were children who needed protecting, families who needed saving, and truth that needed telling, Malachi Brooks would be there. Not because he was a hero, but because he was a man who'd finally learned the difference between running from responsibility and running toward it. The wooden horse pendant bounced against his chest as he rode, a reminder of promises made and kept, of innocence lost and justice found, of the endless fight between those who would destroy and those who would protect. In his saddlebags, he carried new letters, new evidence, new hope for families who thought they had none. The conspiracy in Arizona Territory wouldn't know what hit them until it was too late to stop the truth from emerging. Behind him, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed Sarah's death, Emily's murder, Ayanna's courage, and the fall of corrupt men who'd thought themselves untouchable. They were eternal witnesses to the human capacity for both evil and good, for both destruction and redemption. And under those stars, a former cavalry officer rode toward his destiny, no longer running from his past, but actively building a better future. The conscience of the territory. As the newspapers had taken to calling him, carrying the memory of the dead and the hope of the living toward whatever battle awaited him next, the work would continue. Justice would be served. And somewhere in the growing darkness, children would sleep safely because one man had chosen to care more about their future than his own comfort. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered.